I'm Ian Carter, and today I'm just going to be chatting to Alick Simmons about his new book, Treated Like Animals, holding here. And I have to say, first of all, I had the privilege of reading an advanced copy of this book, and it's an absolutely fantastic book. It's a really complicated subject, animal welfare, a really wide-ranging subject, but it's explained really clearly in the book, a complicated subject sort of summarized really clearly, and it's a very entertaining book at the same time. So it certainly helped me to clarify my views on a lot of things, and I can't think of a book that I've read actually in the last few years that has been so sort of thought-provoking, made me think so hard about a subject. So no, it's congratulations, it's a brilliant book. So yeah, I mean, the first question, I suppose, is about the wide-ranging nature of the book. I mean, it covers everything from livestock farming, hunting, shooting, animals that are used in research, conservation, which is perhaps a more surprising area, and even sort of pets or ownership of pets and the way we sometimes exploit them. And I wondered whether that was your plan right from the word go when you came to write this book, or did it sort of evolve during the writing and you sort of added on subjects as you came across them?
Well, it would be nice to say, Ian, and thank you very much for your comments. It would be nice to say that this was all planned out well in advance, and I did have a lot of thoughts about how I might do it. But inevitably, I think it probably applies to all books, it changes as you start to write. I was always very keen, though, that I made it as broad a sweep as possible, because what has always bothered me, or has increasingly bothered me, is the way in which we treat animals in different compartments, and why we seem to accept very, very different treatment for animals in one compartment, for example, say research animals, versus the way we treat wild animals or the way we treat pets. Recognizing that as the evidence builds up from research about the ability of these animals to feel pain, to suffer, and also certainly more and more evidence about their ability to understand, to anticipate, and even actually have some emotions. And that doesn't simply disappear if you're in a laboratory or you're about to be trapped on a grouse floor, or you're going to be kept for producing milk. Each of these animals is capable of being or suffering, irrespective of the circumstances in which we put it. And I was keen to try and sort of break down those barriers. And even though the book is split into these groups, the idea is that we move towards a set of circumstances where we think about these animals rather than what they are, rather than what we use them for.
Yeah, absolutely. And the fact that it's wide ranging, I think there's some really interesting points emerge from that. And one example I think you keep coming back to is the inconsistencies in the way we treat animals across these different areas. And I think probably your favourite example in the book is the humble and unfortunate in some circumstances common rat.
Yes.
And obviously we keep rats, or some people keep rats as pets. They're used in laboratory research. And then there's the issue of pest control when they end up causing us problems. And as you point out in the book, it's exactly the same beast in all these situations, but we treat them so differently, both in our attitudes towards them and also in actually the way the legislation treats them. So, yeah, I find that a fascinating subject. If we were starting from scratch, I think we'd certainly design the legislation, I think, much more logically based on science and evidence, and yet we seem stuck in this mode where the cultural responses to this creature varies so much. I mean, do you think there's any hope of actually getting a more logical science-based approach, or are we kind of stuck with these inconsistencies and there's not much we can do about
it? I think where animal use, animal exploitation, or call it what you like, is well regulated, is actually really quite well regulated. So I think that the way in which research animals are regulated. And whatever your views are about whether animals should be experimented on or not, you can't deny that the regulation there is rigorous. In fact, some people would say it's draconian, but it does hold the people that are doing the work very firmly to account. And that is really quite at odds, or at least it's sharp contrast when it comes to wildlife and when it comes to farmed animals to an extent, but particularly wildlife. Now, let's be clear, I'm not naive about this. I don't expect the way in which animals are treated in a research environment to be easily picked up and dropped onto how you might treat wildlife. But it's also clear that when you look at research animals, where the premises is licensed, the individuals doing the work is licensed, the procedures are licensed, and the actual way in which the work is done is written out in great detail and subject to a great deal of independent scrutiny, both in terms of the techniques and the ethics and the pressure to reduce, replace, and refine the work that's being done. You compare that with wildlife, and you mentioned rats. The main way in which we kill rats in this country and probably around the world is using poisons which the government's own agency has said these are demonstrably inherently inhumane. And it sort of grieves me that what we're doing is saying, well, if we've got a laboratory rat, which might have some pretty unpleasant things done to it, but it's regulated, there's a need for anesthesia, analgesia, or whatever else might be necessary to ensure that whatever procedures are taken with the objective of trying to get some data about, for example, improving public health, then that is subject to a great deal of scrutiny. Whereas you've got wild animals, and it applies to rats, it also applies to a variety of other creatures which are killed routinely in the countryside, where the regulation is just about zero, and it really is untenable. So going back to the question you asked, is do you see that there's a way of doing this? Well, I think there is possibly. What's interesting is that you've already got conservation bodies holding themselves better to account by ethical groups, and I sit on a couple of these already, where they hold themselves to account, they bring in independent people, and they scrutinize all of the plans that they might be doing to, for example, kill carrion crows to protect ground nesting birds like curlews, which are in steep decline. Whereas you compare that with what goes on a grouse shoot or a pheasant shoot, where similar techniques are used, but there's no scrutiny. There's no requirement for the people to be individually trained. There's no independent oversight of how it's done. And there's no requirement for the people to be trained in how they're doing this. And I think those contrasts are quite stark. And I think that's what drew me to get involved in this in the way I have.
Yeah, no, that's fascinating. I mean, a rat in a garden, anyone who's almost completely untrained can go and buy the product from a garden centre, put it out, and as you say, it works by allowing the creature to slowly bleed to death over several days, and almost you can do virtually what you like to a wild rat. So no, that's really interesting. I mean, I'd say the book is not at all preachy, and I think you even caution against that in the book. That's often not particularly a helpful approach. So the aim of the book, but I think what it does really, really well, is to provide of the background information to allow people to make their own decisions and come to their own views. But you do, towards the end, set out some of your own views and summarize how you've reached those decisions, which is fascinating. And there were two points. First thing I noticed, I mean, it's such a complicated area that there's some areas where you admit that you're still undecided, even
Yeah,
having thought about it over all this time and written the book and pulled all the information together. You're still undecided, which shows how complicated it is. But I suppose a question that emerged. I wondered if your views on any particular position had shifted very specifically as a result of pulling information together for this book.
Well, I think it has. I think over time, my attitudes have changed. The blurb will say I spent a long time working in government, working on disease control on behalf of the UK government. And so therefore I sort of got really inured to what was quite pretty vigorous and sometimes, I wouldn't say brutal, but pretty stark stuff we had to do, like depopulating farms, possibly sometimes killing hundreds of thousands of animals. So you become somewhat sensitized to that. But at the same time, I became more and more concerned about the position that government was adopting about badger culling, which struck me as being probably not going to be successful and almost certainly inhumane in the way it's done. And I think the other thing that I've tried to bring out in the book, it tended to, like many of the things that are done to animals, exclude a substantial proportion of the population from any real say in decision making. I live in Somerset, South Somerset, where badger culling has been going on for probably nearly a decade now. Many of the badger sets are reduced in number to a very large extent, but despite being a resident in a village in which I lived for over 20 years, I've never been told that it's going to happen, when, where, for how long, what the outcome is. The only reason I know about it is I happen to have become quite friendly with the farmer down the road who is allowing this to take place in his land. And he gleefully tells me how many badgers have been killed in the last 6-week cull that's taken place over his land. And then
the friendship has survived that exchange, has it?
Well, it has, yes, it has. He's a decent sort of bloke, but it's what is a great shame about this is that if that was a new hospital was being built, or a motorway, or perhaps they were going to decide or think about fracking, or even burying nuclear waste, we as general public would be consulted. Even if they were going to be building a couple of houses down the road, we would be consulted. But removing 80–90% of native wildlife from your own backyard, where they come into my garden and eat peanuts when I put them out and raid my compost bin, they've all been removed without so much as a by your leave. And the idea that all of this is supposedly being done in our name, legally, I find it absolutely extraordinary that we've done that. So that's sort of where my attitudes have hardened from. I still eat meat, relatively small amounts. I'm quite careful about how I buy it, but I wouldn't say I'm always consistent. I worry, and you said I was a bit conflicted. I'm conflicted about dairy products. I think a lot of dairy cows are not treated well. I think they are destined to a very short life as a result of the way in which we feed them and breed them, so that they are physiologically knackered by the time they reach 5, 6, 7 years old. I worry about broiler meat because of the scale and of the operation. And I've still yet to reach a conclusion about this. I went through a period of eating French cheese because I was worried about the fact that all the cheese I was eating was produced from farms in Britain, where the badgers had all been shot. But I'm told they shoot badgers there as well. So I worry. I really do. And I haven't got a conclusion about it. Similarly, when it comes to fish, it's quite clear to me that fish, from the evidence that I've read, feel pain. So therefore, when they're dragged up from the depths using a hook and line, or whether caught on a trawler and pulled up with tens of thousands of other fish, probably getting crushed and getting a terrible change in pressure as they come up towards the surface. those animals are almost certainly suffering, but I still eat fish. I eat less of it than I used to, and both my children, who are adults now, have become vegetarians. In fact, my new grandson is vegetarian at the moment. He hasn't got the choice at the moment because he's only 6 months old. But over time, people's attitudes are changing, and I'm in my 60s now. My attitudes have changed as a result of my experience, but also the way in which society is changing as well. So some of it's about cultural, some of it's about evidence, and also just the development of your own personal values.
Yeah, no, that's interesting you say about changing attitudes, because certainly when it comes to things like hunting and shooting, I found my attitudes have just slowly morphed gradually over the years. And I wrote about this in my last book as a chapter called Green Unpleasant Land, which is about encounters with inadvertent encounters with the sort of field sports, shooting, hunting. And I very much used to be of the view that it wasn't my thing, but if other people are into that, live and let live, everybody's different. But it's gradually shifted, because if you live in the countryside, these things in many ways are kind of imposed on you. You end up stumbling across larson traps where people are catching carrion crows. You stumble into a pheasant shoot, or you find the injured birds, in the hedgerows. I've had injured pigeons from a pigeon shoot that are flopping down into the garden, and you can end up in the middle of a fox hunt if you're not careful, or in Devon, where I used to live, a stag hunt. So you can't really avoid it. And my views, I think, as yours have definitely hardened. And I think that is one area in the book where you are sort of really forceful about, particularly, say, fox hunting, that there really is absolutely no excuse for it. The legislation doesn't allow it now in theory, but of course it still goes on. So I thought that was perhaps where you're most sort of polemic in the book.
Yeah, I think that's true. And I think one of the things I'm really keen to sort of get people to think about is the how, which we've talked a bit about: trapping, poisoning, shooting, hunting. But there's also the question about why. And that is a societal question. Why do we do this? Or why do we tolerate this? Or why don't we have some say? And I take the view that in getting society individually, or better still collectively, to have a bit more say over how we do these things, is the way forward. And I one of the things I brought out is that within the research community, and I would emphasize I'm not a cheerleader for the research community, even though I think it does some good work. I'm deeply concerned about some aspects of it. But what they have done is engage people in a way which few of the other sectors have done. And I think that needs to be applauded, because it's an extraordinarily sensitive, contentious, and really difficult area for people to get involved in. And yet somehow, through the Concord app, which I detail in the book, this organization has opened up the books in a way which few other sectors of animal exploitation and use have done. To be fair, I think farming is starting to open up a little bit more, but the vast majority of the meat we eat, pigs and poultry, for example, are kept in environments where we don't get to see. And now we're not being invited into research establishments, but the data is there, more information is there. Home Office produces all sorts of information about how many animals are used, why, what for, how they're split down, and then the Concordat, and which various different organizations have signed up to, is providing more information too. So openness and involvement is the way forward, which is the way in which change happens. And I mentioned, and we both talked about farmed animals. One of the things I noticed was, if you go back through the history of how the way in which we keep laying hens, the hens that produce the eggs that we eat, has changed over the years. it wasn't science that said birds in cages are frustrated, they are prevented from expressing or the full repertoire of normal behavior. It was the general public was saying, we are uncomfortable with the way in which these birds look. We don't like to see them in cages, and we want something done about it. And a great deal of effort was put in by governments and other organizations into research to understand whether or not these birds were genuinely frustrated, were their welfare being damaged, and it was proven to be. So that's what drove the banning of the unfurnished, the barren cage. Now, many people would argue that the newer cages, which have got nest boxes, perches, and a variety of other furniture in them, are not necessarily the panacea that perhaps they were first put out to be, but it's a step forward. It's also demonstrably something which happened as a result of the general public saying, we're unhappy with this, we need to do something about it. So we could do more, and this applies to every aspect of the way in which animal production and animal use is going. And now, I do mention Wild Justice, and I probably need to give them a bit of a shout out as well. I've worked a bit with Mark Avery and Ruth Tingay, and peripherally with Chris Packham. Wild Justice is doing some good work, and one of the things they're doing is shining a light through challenging some of the routine legal or ostensibly legal practices that take place in the countryside to so-called manage wildlife. And I think that's changing attitudes. I think it's drawing in funds, which is no bad thing, but it's also raising the awareness amongst people who, for the most part, for whatever reason, don't get an opportunity to get exposed to this.
It's amazing, isn't it, that it's left to sort of three individuals working so hard on their own and raising their own funds in order to do this work. I mean, it really shouldn't be that way, but that's where we are, I suppose.
Well, I think you're right. In order to be able to challenge the status quo, there ought to be mechanisms which don't involve you going to court every time something goes wrong. This is not America. This is supposed to be an organization, a country where democratic norms rule the roost. And the ability to influence MPs, the ability to influence the government through a variety of different mechanisms shouldn't rely just on taking people to court. It just seems crackers to me. So I would like to see more engagement through perhaps citizen assemblies, which have been used in a number of different countries to understand how better by drawing how you might change things by drawing on wider opinion from informed but not necessarily deeply knowledgeable people, so that you end up with a broad spectrum opinion, which then subsequently informs legislators and influences legislators about how you might move forward to something which is probably better for the animals, but also reflects the views of society as a whole.
Absolutely. I think we've got time for just one more, and I'd wanted just to come back to conservation, if I could, because that's my career was in conservation as an ornithologist, and it's perhaps, some people might say it's an unlikely chapter of the book, but I found it one of the most fascinating, and the way welfare issues come into so many aspects of conservation. So you've got the more obvious ones, like the control of one species, a predator perhaps, in order to protect a more vulnerable or rarer species, but it's much more than that. And you talk about things like catching animals so that they can be fitted with rings and tags to get conservation information. Reintroductions, where again you're catching birds up, catching animals up, potentially rearing them in captivity, releasing them into the wild elsewhere. There's all sorts of welfare implications there. Even things like fencing. If you've got a nature reserve with ground nesting birds, some of these birds are now fenced off from predators, and you make the point that impacts on the way predators can behave. But particularly the point you make is that conservationists, I think, are well placed to maybe set a particularly good example. So to have good policies to try and minimise welfare impacts, be as transparent and as accountable as possible. And it's a subject I don't think it's written about as often as it should be, but the chapter was absolutely fascinating. I found that really interesting.
Well, thank you. This business about conservation is as soon as you put, and I worked with a vet years ago, he says, as soon as you put a fence around it, a group of animals, they're your responsibility. Now, that fence can be a physical one, or they can be, if you like, a metaphorical one. And a metaphorical fence in this context is probably the equivalent of, say, mist netting or trapping for population studies or whatever else. And therefore, as soon as you start to intervene, you've got this responsibility which rests on the shoulders of the organization, of the individual that decides they're going to do this. And again, I would draw the contrast between what we know about the impact of bird ringing, where the BTO, which is the organization that is authorized to license ringers, but also controls every aspect of it, who can do it, where it's done, and the mechanisms that are used. The data that's been collected there, where they know what proportion of birds have suffered or died or injured whilst they've been caught in mist nets or other trapping mechanisms. And they've also got how and why and what species by species. And as a result of that, they constantly change the way in which they do things. And I suppose going back to the business about wildlife management elsewhere or interventions with wildlife elsewhere, I don't think there's any data about saying, well, we've been using stoat traps on this estate in comparison with this estate down the road, and this is the proportion we find that have been killed outright in a very short period of time versus the ones down the road where a slightly different technique is. I don't think there's any information about that. If there is, it's not published. So this is where I would say that the conservation organizations, like the RSPB, BTO, and so forth, by shining a light on what they do, exposing themselves to independent scrutiny, which is what at least the RSPB does, and I know the Natural Trust do because I help them as well, in a way which means that their interventions, first of all, are managed down to the absolute minimum, and they hold themselves to very high accounts. And second, they publish what they do. Now, they could do more. I think the RSPB could do more than it does, and I'm sure one or two other organizations could do a lot more. But in comparison with the other organizations, the shooting organizations and their clients, their members, such as large shooting estates, or even for that matter, farms where wildlife control takes place, there's almost no scrutiny and certainly very, very little data collected. So those contrasts are great. So this is why I think the conservation organizations could be in a position to actually take the moral high ground and be an exemplar for other practices elsewhere.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that's probably a good time to end. I'm conscious of a little alarming sort of ticking clock that's getting perilously close to zero on my screen here. But no, thanks very much for the chat.
Thank you very much.
And congratulations on what was a fantastic book. I'm sure the details will be put up on the screen about where it can be ordered from Pelagic Publishing. It's a brilliant book, and thanks for talking to me about it.
Well, and something I should say is that Ian's hidden his light under a bushel here. Not only has he read the book in advance, he very kindly went through it all in a very early stage and made some really helpful suggestions about how to shape it, and also corrected a lot of my grammar. So I'm very grateful to your input, which has been more or less from the day one, really, really useful. So thank you.
Great to see it out there. Great to see it out in the world.
It's really exciting stuff.